The morning sun rose slowly over the small Midwestern town, casting golden light over the quiet streets and sleepy brick buildings. The courthouse, a modest but stately structure in the heart of the town, stood as a symbol of order and tradition. Its tall, arched windows reflected the soft shimmer of dawn, and the carved stone facade seemed to whisper the countless stories of justice, triumphs, and failures that had passed through its doors over decades. On the steps, a few early visitors shuffled in, clutching papers or briefcases, their faces set with the determination of people caught in the gravity of routine civic duty. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and strong coffee. The air hummed with the subtle energy of anticipation, the sort of quiet tension that always precedes legal proceedings. Metal detectors beeped occasionally as courthouse staff guided visitors through security, their voices low and methodical. A uniformed deputy, tall and square-shouldered, waved a family of three through, offering a polite nod as they passed. The mother, Mary Reynolds, held her young son's hand tightly, trying to keep him calm as he fidgeted against her side. Her son, 3-year-old Noah, bounced lightly on his tiny feet, his big brown eyes scanning every corner of the bustling space with a curiosity only a child could possess. Mary whispered to him, trying to calm his excitement. "No running, Noah. We're here to sit quietly for Uncle Tim," she said, brushing a strand of sandy hair from his forehead. Noah nodded solemnly, but his gaze was already wandering. He had the uncanny ability to notice details that adults overlooked, the small tile patterns on the floor, the way sunlight hit the marble banisters, the faint scent of disinfectant mixed with coffee that seemed to permeate every corridor. To him, the courthouse was a maze of secret doors and hidden stories. Mary squeezed his hand, feeling the nervous tension that had been building in her chest for days. Her brother, Timothy Reynolds, was the defendant in the trial scheduled for that morning. Though it was technically a minor burglary case, the stakes felt enormous. Timothy was known in the town as a hardworking handyman with a checkered past, the kind of man who had always tried to make things right but whose mistakes had a way of catching up to him. Mary worried not only about the outcome of the trial, but also about how the public would perceive her family. The town was small, whispers carried like wind through the streets, and reputations were fragile. Noah, however, remained blissfully unaware of the weight of these adult concerns. He tugged gently at Mary's hand, pointing toward the bench where a large, black and tan police dog sat quietly with its handler. "Doggy," he whispered, eyes wide. "Why he here?" Mary shushed him gently. "Just for work, honey, he's helping the people here." But Noah's curiosity was uncontainable. He inched closer, craning his neck to get a better view. The dog, Rex, was impressive even to adults, tall, muscular, and impeccably trained. His ears twitched slightly, alert to the faintest sound, and his nose moved in subtle, calculated sweeps. Rex had been part of the local police force for nearly 4 years, assisting in searches, tracking, and evidence detection. Yet despite his imposing presence, he exuded a calm authority that seemed almost gentle in the bustling courtroom. The courtroom itself was a study in contrast. Its walls were painted in muted cream, lined with rows of polished oak benches that gleamed under the morning light. A raised platform at the front held the judge's bench, flanked by American and state flags, and beneath it, the defense and prosecution tables faced each other like two chess players preparing their moves. The room smelled faintly of old books, paper, and a subtle hint of floor wax, a scent that seemed permanently etched into the building. For most people, this environment conveyed seriousness and restraint, but for Noah, it was a playground of intrigue. Timothy Reynolds arrived shortly after his family, escorted by a uniformed deputy. His face was calm, almost serene, but Mary could see the subtle tension in his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. He waved briefly to his sister, a small gesture meant to reassure her, but inside, the weight of the proceedings pressed heavily on him. He took his seat at the defense table, smoothing the front of his jacket, his hands shaking just enough to betray the nerves he tried to conceal. Across the room, the prosecution team moved with the efficiency of people accustomed to the courtroom's rhythm. They arranged files, whispered quietly, and occasionally glanced at the defendant with the faintest hint of suspicion or certainty. It was impossible to tell which. As the morning moved forward, the spectators began to trickle in. Familiar faces of townspeople filled the benches, each carrying their own preconceived notions and quietly forming judgments. Some nodded politely at Timothy, a few shook their heads, and others whispered conspiratorially to neighbors. Mary noted every glance, every subtle shift of expression. It was a delicate balance. She had come to support her brother, yet she couldn't help feeling the heavy eyes of the town upon him. Noah, meanwhile, had discovered a small fascination. He crouched down, peering between the legs of the spectators, and noticed the faint glint of something metallic on the floor near the deputy's boots. He pointed and whispered softly to Rex, "Shiny thing." The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move, trained as he was to ignore distractions. Yet Noah's fascination with every detail, the patterns of light on the floor, the subtle movements of people, the sounds of papers shuffling, gave him an observational edge few could match, even unknowingly. The trial was about to begin, the judge's gavel poised to strike, but the morning had already taken on a life of its own. A sense of anticipation hung in the air, invisible but palpable, as if the courthouse itself knew that something unusual was on the horizon. Timothy adjusted his tie and exhaled deeply, trying to calm the storm of nerves that churned beneath the surface. Mary rubbed his shoulder briefly, offering a silent message of solidarity. Noah shifted again, standing on tiptoe, his tiny hands resting on the edge of the bench. He whispered to Rex once more, "Hello, doggy. You find it." The words were innocent, almost musical in their simplicity. Nobody paid attention. Adults had no reason to consider a toddler's observations as relevant, yet those words would, in time, become the spark that would illuminate hidden truth and disrupt the ordinary flow of justice. Outside the courtroom, the sun climbed higher, casting long, stretching shadows across the polished floors. The town's rhythm continued. Birds sang outside the windows, cars passed on the quiet streets, and life moved as usual. Yet within the courthouse, every small action, the shuffle of papers, the rustle of clothing, the quiet murmur of conversations, converged toward a moment that no one could predict. A toddler's curiosity, a police dog's presence, and the tension of a routine trial were about to collide in a way that would leave the town, the courtroom, and the Reynolds family forever changed. As the court clerk called the room to order, the judge's robes rustling, Timothy straightened in his chair, preparing himself for a proceeding he expected to be normal. Mary held her son's hand, trying to suppress a flicker of anxiety, unaware that her child's innocence would soon become a pivotal force. Noah, oblivious to the tension and stakes, tilted his head toward Rex again, a quiet smile playing across his lips. In the simplicity of his observation lay the seeds of a story that would soon captivate the entire town, a story of truth, coincidence, and the remarkable ability of innocence to reveal what even adults could not see. And as the gavel finally struck, signaling the official start of what everyone assumed would be a routine case, the courthouse seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the sunlight glimmered, shadows danced across the walls, and within the solemn halls, an ordinary trial was about to become anything but ordinary. Timothy Reynolds sat at the defense table, the polished wood cool beneath his fingertips. His posture was upright, almost rigid, yet there was a quiet tension that betrayed the weight he carried. At 28, he was neither unusually young nor old for someone caught in the complexities of the law, yet the stakes felt larger in the small Midwestern town where everyone knew everyone's history. Timothy's reputation hung precariously in the balance. To the townspeople, he was a man who had worked hard, tried to make right, and occasionally faltered. To the prosecution, he was a convenient suspect, a figure whose past missteps painted him as capable of wrongdoing. Across the courtroom, jurors whispered quietly among themselves. Some were elderly residents who had lived in the town all their lives, their faces etched with lines that suggested a lifetime of judgment and observation. Others were younger, seemingly more detached, but even they couldn't entirely escape the weight of small-town scrutiny. Every glance, every subtle expression, seemed to carry meaning, interpreted and reinterpreted by those who had spent years reading people like open books. Timothy's hands tightened around the edge of the table as he took in the silent gazes, his heart pounding with a mix of nervousness and defiance. Mary Reynolds, seated a few rows behind him, tried to remain composed. Her eyes, wide and anxious, flitted between her brother, the jurors, and the prosecutor. Her son, Noah, sat beside her, fidgeting and whispering to himself in the innocent chatter that only a 3-year-old could produce. She knew the child was oblivious to the weight of the trial, yet she couldn't help but feel protective. Timothy had always been close to his family, and she had seen firsthand the strain of living under suspicion, even when innocence remained intact. Today, the trial felt like more than a legal proceeding. It felt like a public test of character. The prosecution team moved with practiced efficiency. Their files were organized meticulously, notes highlighted with precision, and their eyes never strayed from Timothy more than necessary. They had reviewed the evidence countless times, confident that their case, though circumstantial, was airtight. Broken locks, fingerprints in questionable locations, and eyewitness accounts painted a picture they believed to be convincing. Yet the air in the courtroom suggested a subtle undercurrent of uncertainty, an intangible sense that, perhaps, not everything was as it seemed. As the judge's gavel tapped against the sound block, signaling the beginning of the trial, Timothy exhaled sharply. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a mix of fear and determination. The minor burglary charge, though seemingly routine, carried implications far beyond the immediate legal consequences. Conviction would bring a permanent mark on his record, possibly affecting his ability to work, his relationships, and his standing in a community that rarely forgot. Timothy straightened his tie and adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, an unconscious attempt to project control over a situation where control was tenuous at best. The gallery remained quiet, yet the subtle murmur of whispers floated like an invisible current through the room. Spectators exchanged glances, some openly sympathetic, others quietly judgmental. Small-town communities were expert at reading signals, at discerning patterns in behavior, at making decisions based on reputations built over years or decades. Timothy was aware of the silent scrutiny. He could feel it in the tiny shift of weight from one observer to another, the way heads tilted slightly when he spoke, the almost imperceptible narrowing of eyes. In such an environment, perception often carried as much weight as fact. Noah, seated beside his mother, remained largely oblivious to the tension that pervaded the courtroom. His focus was divided among small details that fascinated him: the polished shine of the floor, the subtle rhythm of footsteps, and most compelling of all, the large police dog stationed near the deputies. The animal Rex exuded a presence that seemed both protective and imposing. Noah's eyes followed every movement, and he occasionally whispered to himself, noting the things adults would overlook. He was, in every way, an observer without judgment, a quiet witness to the proceedings in a way no one could anticipate. Mary noticed her son's attention to the dog and smiled faintly, though her mind remained occupied with her brother's predicament. She watched Timothy, noting the subtle tension in his shoulders and the way his fingers drummed lightly on the table. He had always been a careful, conscientious man, often meticulous to the point of obsession with details, yet today those traits would not shield him from the scrutiny of a courtroom. She could see the worry in his eyes, the flicker of hope that he would be believed, that the truth would rise above the assumptions. As the first witness was called, Timothy's pulse quickened. The burglary had occurred several weeks prior, a relatively minor crime in monetary terms but significant in its implications for reputation and trust. The prosecution painted the scene with vivid detail: broken locks, disorganized shelves, missing items. Each fact seemed carefully curated to reinforce their narrative. Yet Timothy, sitting quietly, felt the weight of omission. The things the prosecution had not considered, the nuances of timing, location, and motive that painted an alternative picture. Outside the immediate proceedings, the town had already begun to form its own narrative. Locals who had gathered near the courthouse windows whispered to each other, speculating about Timothy's guilt or innocence. Social circles discussed the case in coffee shops and grocery stores, each person offering interpretation and judgment. It was a pattern familiar in small towns. Speculation often equaled truth in perception, regardless of actual fact. Timothy, for all his composure, knew that public opinion could influence outcomes indirectly, shaping jurors' subconscious understanding and expectation. The defense attorney, a middle-aged man named Harold Jensen, moved with calm authority. He had defended numerous cases over his 20-year career, yet he approached this trial with deliberate caution. His eyes met Timothy's briefly, offering a silent assurance. "We'll get through this," he seemed to say without words. Harold's strategy was methodical. Discredit circumstantial evidence where possible, highlight gaps in timing and narrative, and most importantly, remind the jurors that reasonable doubt was a cornerstone of justice. Yet even as he spoke, he knew the case hinged on more than legal argument. It relied on perception, truth, and unexpectedly, chance. Noah, meanwhile, shifted in his seat, standing on tiptoe to get a better view of the courtroom. He whispered questions to his mother, simple and innocent. "Mommy, why the dog here? Is Uncle Tim bad?" Mary offered quiet, evasive answers, hoping to preserve his innocence. Yet the child's gaze remained fixed on Rex, the animal's presence oddly reassuring to the toddler. The dog's calm demeanor seemed to captivate Noah, drawing his attention in ways the adults could not predict. Little did anyone know, this simple fascination would later play a critical role in unraveling the case. As the trial proceeded, witnesses gave testimony. The first, a neighbor who claimed to have seen Timothy near the scene on the night of the burglary, spoke in careful, measured tones. Her words were precise, yet the defense attorney quickly noted inconsistencies in her account. Shadows misremembered, times conflated, and a description of events that lacked alignment with the physical evidence. Timothy's heart pounded as Harold challenged each statement, exposing the gaps that could create doubt. It was a delicate dance of narrative, memory, and persuasion, unfolding under the keen eyes of the jury and spectators. Mary watched her brother, feeling the simultaneous sting of fear and pride. He had always been resilient, the sort of person who confronted challenges head-on, yet she worried about the subtle power of suggestion and bias in the courtroom. The trial was more than a legal exercise. It was a psychological battlefield. Every gesture, tone of voice, and expression mattered, shaping the story that jurors would carry with them into deliberation. Timothy remained composed outwardly, but internally he braced for the uncertainty that could tip the scales of justice. Meanwhile, Noah continued his quiet observations. His tiny mind cataloged details, noting every subtle interaction, every shift in posture, and the faint gleam of metal in the deputy's hands. He whispered softly to himself, a stream of curiosity that went largely unnoticed by the adults. Yet even in his innocence, he began to connect threads that no one else had considered, picking up on cues that would soon become vital. In this way, the 3-year-old and the police dog, seated quietly in the back, became silent witnesses to a drama far beyond their comprehension. By mid-morning, tension in the courtroom had thickened. Testimony revealed conflicting accounts, and the prosecution's confidence began to show minor cracks. Timothy's calm demeanor, paired with his attorney's careful cross-examinations, created subtle ripples in the narrative the jury had begun to form. The small-town spectators, whispering and leaning forward in their seats, sensed that the trial was no longer routine. Even the deputies glanced toward the audience and the defendant, sensing the unpredictability that now hung in the air. And through it all, Noah's innocent presence remained a quiet, almost imperceptible force. His attention to detail, curiosity about the dog, and instinctive observations were unremarkable in the moment. Yet in the delicate ecosystem of the courthouse, where truth, perception, and chance intertwined. His role was quietly setting the stage for a revelation that would soon upend assumptions, challenge authority, and expose secrets hidden from all but the most observant eyes. By late morning, the courtroom had settled into a rhythm, though the tension never fully dissipated. Timothy sat upright, composed, yet the undercurrent of anxiety remained. Mary's eyes never left him, and Noah's attention remained on Rex. Outside, townspeople paused in doorways or along sidewalks, curious about the proceedings within. The small Midwestern courthouse, a place typically home to routine cases and quiet proceedings, had become a theater of subtle suspense, a place where every detail, no matter how small, carried weight. And as the first breaks in testimony approached, the sense of inevitability mingled with possibility. For Timothy Reynolds, the trial had begun as routine, but the environment, the audience, and the unpredictable observers, both human and canine, hinted that the ordinary rules might not fully apply. Something imperceptible yet extraordinary was quietly taking shape, a delicate chain of events poised to ripple outward, changing perceptions, revealing truths, and testing the very limits of justice in ways no one could yet foresee. The courthouse seemed to hum with quiet anticipation as Mary Reynolds guided her son, Noah, down the polished oak benches. The child's small hand clutched hers tightly, his tiny fingers warm against hers, yet his steps were light and restless. At 3 years old, Noah was an endless bundle of energy and curiosity, capable of seeing the world in ways adults often overlooked. Today, he was entirely captivated by the formal, orderly world of the courtroom, the echo of footsteps on the polished floor, the low murmur of voices, and the solemn rhythm of the proceedings. Mary had not intended for Noah to accompany her. She had planned a simple visit, support her brother Timothy, and leave shortly after the trial began. But a last-minute childcare conflict had left her with no choice but to bring him along. She had reassured herself that he would remain quietly by her side, perhaps doodling in a notebook she had brought, or gazing silently around the room. Yet as soon as she set foot in the courtroom, it became apparent that Noah was not one to simply observe passively. From the moment they entered, Noah's eyes darted around the room with ceaseless curiosity. Every detail captured his attention: the subtle pattern of the carpet, the way sunlight struck the wooden railing, the orderly stacks of legal documents at the tables. Yet his fascination quickly found its center: Rex, the police K-9 stationed near the deputies, whose imposing form and calm demeanor drew the toddler's gaze like a magnet. To Noah, Rex was not just a working dog. He was a creature of intrigue, silently commanding the room with a mix of authority and gentle presence. "Doggy," Noah whispered under his breath, his voice barely audible above the low hum of conversation. "Why here?" Mary leaned down, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "He's here to help, Noah. That's all you need to know." She smiled faintly, hopping to divert his attention. But Noah was already kneeling slightly, craning his neck to get a better look. The child's focus was unrelenting, and Mary could only watch as he edged closer to Rex, utterly fascinated by the dog's presence. Rex, for his part, remained calm and composed. His ears twitched occasionally, his nostrils flaring with subtle inhalations of scent, yet he ignored the child entirely. The K-9 had been trained to remain neutral, to follow commands from his handler, and to avoid distraction in sensitive environments. Yet Noah's curiosity seemed to operate on a different plane, unbound by rules or caution. He leaned closer, whispering questions the dog could not answer but somehow seemed to hear. "Doggy, what you smell?" Nearby deputies glanced at the child, surprised by his boldness, yet said nothing. Adults in the room were preoccupied with the proceedings, the legal papers, and the unspoken dynamics of judgment. To them, Noah was merely a fidgeting child, his whispers inconsequential. Yet in the delicate ecosystem of observation and evidence, his small, innocent attentions were quietly beginning to notice details that others had overlooked. Timothy sat at the defense table, adjusting his jacket nervously. He was aware of his family in the gallery, and he cast a brief glance toward Mary and Noah. He saw the child kneeling beside Rex, talking in soft murmurs. A faint, almost amused smile crossed his face. He had always appreciated children's honesty and lack of pretense, but he also recognized that this innocence in the charged environment of the courtroom could have consequences nobody anticipated. Mary tried to refocus Noah, suggesting he sit quietly. "Noah, sit down next to me. Watch the people talk," she whispered. He obeyed for a moment but then leaned forward again, curiosity getting the better of him. His attention was drawn to the deputies' hands, the faint glint of metal on their belts, and the rhythmic tapping of shoes on the polished floor. Every sensory detail seemed magnified to him: the echo of a gavel, the subtle smell of paper, the way sunlight glinted off Rex's collar. Meanwhile, the court proceedings continued. The judge, a stern but fair man in his 60s, began outlining the structure of the trial, reminding all present of the need for decorum and accuracy. Witnesses were called, and lawyers moved with the practiced precision of professionals accustomed to routine. Timothy maintained a composed demeanor, answering questions with careful thought, while Harold Jensen, his defense attorney, subtly guided the narrative in a manner designed to challenge assumptions. Yet even as the adults engaged in the formal dance of testimony, Noah remained quietly observant, registering details that would later prove pivotal. Noah's attention wandered repeatedly to Rex. The dog, sitting obediently beside the handler, exuded a quiet strength that fascinated the child. He leaned closer, whispering observations that adults could not understand. "Doggy, shiny thing," he murmured, pointing subtly at the floor near the deputy's feet. To him, it was a simple observation, a curiosity sparked by the glint of sunlight on metal. To anyone else, it was meaningless. But in the courtroom, where evidence and truth hung delicately in balance, small details often carried enormous weight. Mary's anxiety fluctuated between worry and awe. She knew her child's curiosity was innocent, yet a subtle unease gripped her. There was something unusual about the intensity of his observation, the way he seemed to notice the seemingly unnoticeable. She attempted to redirect him, offering soft words and occasional distractions, but Noah's attention remained fixed on Rex and the deputies, drawn as if by an invisible thread. The prosecution continued presenting evidence, emphasizing the timeline, the alleged involvement of Timothy, and the circumstantial details that suggested guilt. Yet as each witness spoke, Noah's small observations accumulated quietly. The child noticed gestures, fleeting glances, and objects in the room that adults passed over. The subtle discrepancy in a deputy's movements, the glimmer of a metallic object tucked partially behind a bench, these were details that, though insignificant in isolation, would later form the threads of a much larger revelation. In the back of the courtroom, other spectators began to take notice of the child's fascination. Some smiled quietly, assuming he was simply restless. Others, particularly those familiar with Timothy's family, felt a pang of curiosity themselves. Yet the adults, caught in their own preoccupations and interpretations, failed to perceive the significance of Noah's attention. He was, in essence, an invisible observer, cataloging information without prejudice or intent, guided only by innate curiosity and a quiet intelligence that belied his age. As the morning wore on, Timothy's calmness remained a striking contrast to the tension around him. He had learned over the years that panic achieved little, and composure could often reveal strength in ways words could not. He answered questions thoughtfully, deflected insinuations without aggression, and allowed his attorney to navigate the intricacies of legal argument. Yet even with this outward composure, he could feel the subtle influence of the community's gaze, the unspoken judgments, the assumptions rooted in history and rumor. Noah, oblivious to the weight of these dynamics, continued his quiet investigation. His small hands occasionally brushed against the edge of the bench, his eyes flicking between deputies, lawyers, and Rex. He whispered words to himself in the soft cadence of a child exploring a new world. "Shiny thing, he muttered, unaware that this seemingly trivial observation was quietly resonating with the rhythms of truth in the courtroom. Mary, torn between anxiety and fascination, watched her son with growing unease. She had come expecting to be a spectator of her brother's trial, but instead, she found herself witnessing something unusual. Noah's attention to detail, his relentless curiosity, and his calm focus on the police dog seemed almost purposeful, as though he were picking up threads in the story that adults had long overlooked. She could not understand how or why, only that his behavior was extraordinary in its subtlety. By mid-morning, the courtroom had settled into a rhythm, yet a sense of anticipation hung in the air. Timothy sat upright, composed and silent, while Noah remained quietly observant, kneeling beside Rex and whispering occasional remarks that went largely unnoticed. Mary's mind raced with worry. She knew her child's behavior was atypical, but she also sensed that something significant was quietly building. In the formal order of the courtroom, the stage was being set for an extraordinary convergence of innocence, observation, and truth. The first witness break came, and Mary moved closer to Noah, kneeling to whisper reassurance. "Noah, let's sit quietly for a minute," she said softly, brushing his hair behind his ear. But Noah's eyes remained fixed on Rex, his attention unwavering. To the adults, this was merely a child's curiosity. Yet, in the intricate web of legal proceedings, such observations often carried more weight than anyone anticipated. As the morning session progressed, Timothy maintained his composure, answering questions with calm precision. His attorney skillfully navigated the cross-examinations, highlighting inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline. And still, Noah observed. His tiny mind absorbed the rhythm of the room, the glint of metal in deputies' hands, the precise movements of the K-9 unit, the subtle expressions of each witness. Each detail was catalogued silently, forming an internal map that would later become pivotal in revealing truths that adults had overlooked. And so, the morning unfolded, a mixture of routine courtroom proceedings, a family quietly bracing under scrutiny, and a child whose innocent curiosity had already begun to notice the threads that would unravel the conventional narrative. The courthouse, steeped in tradition and expectation, had unknowingly become a theater for subtle observation, where the smallest presence, Noah, 3 years old, was quietly preparing to play a role that would forever alter the outcome of a trial that everyone assumed would be ordinary. The courthouse was bathed in the warm glow of mid-morning sunlight, slanting through the tall windows and casting elongated shadows across the polished wooden floors. Timothy Reynolds sat rigidly at the defense table, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the smooth surface. Though he appeared calm, the tension in his shoulders betrayed his inner anxiety. Across the room, the prosecution team exchanged quiet nods, confident that their carefully orchestrated narrative would prevail. Yet beneath the surface of routine courtroom proceedings, an unexpected variable quietly stirred, a factor invisible to most of the adults present. The presence of Rex, the police K-9, and the unwavering attention of a small, 3-year-old observer. Rex, a seasoned German shepherd with a sleek black and tan coat, moved through the courtroom with the grace and precision that only years of training could produce. His muscles rippled under his fur as he walked, head slightly lowered, nostrils flaring in measured inhalations. Though he was calm and composed, his presence was commanding, a silent testament to the rigorous training he had endured since puppyhood. Rex's duties in the courthouse were routine: accompany deputies, remain alert to threats, and assist in evidence verification when necessary. Today, however, the rhythm of his routine would be subtly disrupted by an observer who saw the world through a lens of pure curiosity. Noah, kneeling near the back row beside his mother, had been watching Rex for nearly 30 minutes. His small fingers drummed lightly on the edge of the bench as his eyes followed the dog's every movement. He whispered softly, a stream of observations no adult paid attention to. "Doggy, sniff, sniff, shiny thing, over there." His voice was barely audible, but his words carried the intensity of a child discovering a hidden world. To Noah, the courthouse was no longer merely a place of order and formality. It was a stage for exploration, filled with objects, scents, and movements that begged to be noticed. Rex's handler, Officer Daniels, moved methodically alongside the dog, unaware of the silent communication unfolding. Daniels had worked with Rex for nearly 5 years, training him to detect substances, locate evidence, and maintain composure under the pressure of a courtroom or crime scene. The two moved in synchrony, a perfect partnership of trust and instinct. Yet today, the dynamics shifted subtly. Noah's whispered observations, his tiny hands pointing and his eyes following the dog's movements, seemed to create a dialogue that no one else in the courtroom could comprehend. As Rex approached the defense table, the child leaned forward. "Doggy, sniff, sniff by Uncle Tim," he murmured under his breath. His words were innocent, almost musical in their cadence, yet they carried implications that no adult could immediately grasp. The subtle reference to Timothy's proximity to certain objects in the room was coincidental, born of curiosity rather than intent. But the human mind, prone to pattern recognition, would later interpret these observations as evidence, giving them significance that Noah himself could not understand. Mary, sensing her son's intense focus, whispered softly to him, "Noah, sit please, watch quietly." But he barely registered her words. His attention was fully consumed by the interaction between Rex and the deputy's careful movements. The child's eyes followed the faint glimmer of metal tucked near the floor, the slight shift of a paper on the deputy's clipboard, and the gentle rustle of the dog's collar as it caught the sunlight. Every sensory input was catalogued with the meticulous precision only a child could achieve unconsciously. The trial continued around them, voices blending into a background hum. Witnesses recounted their statements, lawyers posed questions, and Timothy maintained his stoic composure. But the subtle interplay between Rex and Noah began to create ripples in the otherwise steady flow of proceedings. A glint on the floor near the deputy's table caught Noah's attention. He pointed with a small finger and whispered, "Shiny thing, doggy find." To an adult, it seemed like the idle chatter of a restless toddler. To anyone trained in observation, it was a hint that something had been overlooked. Rex, moving closer to the object, sniffed deliberately. The dog's nose twitched as he circled the small metallic item, alert but controlled. Officer Daniels followed his movements attentively, unaware that the child's soft voice had subtly influenced the dog's attention, drawing him toward an area of the room previously deemed insignificant. In that instant, the routine of the courtroom, a place of predictable order and procedure, was disrupted in ways no one could yet comprehend. Mary's anxiety grew. She had brought Noah expecting a minor distraction, a child's harmless curiosity, but now she sensed that something extraordinary was unfolding. She watched as her son leaned closer to Rex, murmuring softly, "Doggy over there, shiny." Her mind raced, unsure how such innocence could intersect with the structured reality of the courtroom. She feared attention, feared disruption, but couldn't deny the sense that Noah was noticing something adults had overlooked. Timothy, sensing the subtle shift in the atmosphere, glanced at his nephew. A faint smile crossed his face, mixed with concern. He had always believed in the clarity of observation. He had trusted in the details even when others did not. Yet even he could not predict that the child's innocent words and the dog's trained instincts would combine to illuminate a truth hidden from all but the most attentive eyes. The prosecution team, busy reviewing notes and preparing for the next witness, remained oblivious. They were confident, as they had been since the morning began, that the case against Timothy was straightforward. Broken locks, circumstantial evidence, and eyewitness testimony painted a narrative they believed unassailable. Yet the undercurrent of subtle observation, unfolding quietly in the back row, began to chip away at their certainty, one imperceptible clue at a time. Noah's attention sharpened further. He leaned closer to Rex, whispering again, "Doggy smell shiny thing, not Uncle Tim." The words were simple, yet in the precise cadence of a child's innocent voice, they carried an unexpected clarity. Mary froze, her heart skipping a beat. She had not anticipated that Noah's idle observations could have meaning beyond mere curiosity. Her gaze darted to Rex, whose trained instincts had now drawn him toward the very object Noah had noticed, a small metallic item partially hidden beneath the edge of a bench. Officer Daniels, following the dog's movement, finally noticed the glint. "What is that?" he muttered quietly to himself. His eyes scanned the area and then he crouched, examining the object. The realization struck subtly yet profoundly. The item had been overlooked during initial inspections, dismissed as insignificant, yet it now demanded attention. In that quiet moment, the trajectory of the trial began to shift. What had been a routine morning of testimony and procedure was quietly transforming into something extraordinary. Mary's pulse quickened. Timothy glanced at her, sensing the heightened tension. The courtroom, previously a controlled environment of orderly observation and formal procedure, now held an undercurrent of suspense. Small details, previously invisible, were beginning to converge into a revelation that would soon challenge assumptions, disrupt narratives, and shift the balance of perceived truth. Noah, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, continued whispering to Rex. "Doggy, yes, over there, see shiny, not Uncle Tim." Each word, a fragment of innocent observation, slowly built into a pattern that adults would later recognize as a critical clue. The interplay between child and dog, instinct and curiosity, became an unspoken dialogue capable of exposing hidden details. The trial progressed around them. Lawyers continued their questioning, witnesses recounted their recollections, and Timothy remained poised. Yet the small threads of observation, Noah's whispers, Rex's trained movements, the glimmer of the metallic object, began to intersect in a manner both improbable and extraordinary. The courthouse, steeped in tradition and routine, had become the stage for an unexpected alliance, innocence and instinct converging to illuminate the unseen. Mary's anxiety mingled with astonishment. She had entered the courtroom expecting nothing more than a routine trial, but now she realized that her child's observations, combined with the dog's training, had become pivotal. Each glance, each subtle motion, carried significance. She could not yet fully comprehend the implications, but instinctively she understood that the ordinary order of events had been quietly disrupted. Rex, his attention unwavering, finally paused near the metallic object, nose close to the surface. Officer Daniels crouched, carefully retrieving the item. Its small size belied its importance. It had been overlooked in the initial sweep, dismissed as irrelevant. Yet in the delicate ecosystem of evidence, every overlooked detail mattered. Noah's innocent attention had highlighted what adults had missed, and now the courtroom faced the potential for a revelation that could alter the case entirely. The prosecution, absorbed in their preparations, had yet to notice the significance. Timothy, meanwhile, felt a subtle shift, a sense that the ordinary rhythm of the trial had changed. The calm, predictable narrative that had guided the morning was quietly unraveling, replaced by a scenario that combined innocence, instinct, and chance in a way that no one could have foreseen. Noah, still kneeling beside Rex, whispered one final observation. "Not Uncle Tim, doggy knows." His words, simple and unintentional, carried a clarity that adults would later interpret as insight. Mary held her breath, unsure whether to intervene, and Timothy sat rigidly, sensing that the morning's routine had quietly transformed into something extraordinary. The judge's gavel, striking to call the next witness, sounded louder than usual in the tense atmosphere. The room, previously steeped in the predictability of routine, now held a sense of anticipation. A small child, a trained police dog, and a glint of overlooked evidence had begun to rewrite the narrative. What had seemed like a normal morning was quietly evolving into a turning point that no one, not even the adults orchestrating the trial, could fully anticipate. And so, the courthouse, steeped in tradition and order, became a theater of subtle revelation. The combination of innocence, observation, and instinct, Noah's attention to detail and Rex's trained precision, had quietly shifted the balance. The ordinary had given way to extraordinary, and the trial that had begun as routine was now poised for a moment of insight that could forever change the outcome. The courtroom had settled into a tense rhythm as the morning stretched into early afternoon. Timothy Reynolds remained at the defense table, his posture firm, his gaze fixed on the floor ahead, yet his mind raced with each passing moment. Witnesses continued their testimony, offering recollections that were carefully structured, rehearsed even, as if the very act of speaking could enforce a reality they wanted the jury to believe. The prosecution's narrative, built on circumstantial evidence and selective memory, seemed airtight, but the ordinary was about to give way to the extraordinary. Noah, still kneeling near the back, had grown increasingly fascinated with Rex, the police dog whose calm presence dominated the room. He whispered softly, his voice barely audible above the murmur of adult conversation. "Doggy, over there, Shiny, not Uncle Tim." These words, simple and innocent, were unnoticed by most, but Mary, seated close by, felt a jolt of awareness. Her child's observation was becoming unusually focused. The repetition, the emphasis on "not Uncle Tim," caused a flicker of both anxiety and curiosity to ripple through her. The defense attorney, Harold Jensen, was deeply engrossed in the cross-examination of the next witness, a local shopkeeper who had allegedly observed Timothy near the scene of the burglary. The shopkeeper's testimony was precise but careful, designed to bolster the prosecution's case. Harold questioned methodically, pointing out inconsistencies in timing and observational gaps. He emphasized that circumstantial evidence, no matter how detailed, could never replace certainty. Yet even as he built his argument, a quieter, unplanned element of the trial began to assert itself. Noah's presence and his attention to Rex were subtly shifting the atmosphere. As the witness described seeing Timothy on the night in question, Noah's tiny hand rose slightly, pointing at Rex. "Doggy knows, not Uncle Tim," he whispered again. This time his words carried a cadence, an emphasis that suggested certainty far beyond his 3 years. Mary's heart pounded. She had always understood her son's attention to detail, but the clarity and timing of his statement felt uncanny, almost prescient. She leaned down slightly, unsure whether to intervene, fearing the attention it might draw, but something inside her urged patience. Rex, trained to respond to scents and subtle cues, paused near the bench where a small metallic object had been discovered earlier. The dog's nose twitched as he signaled interest, circling the area with methodical precision. Officer Daniels, noticing the dog's focus, crouched to inspect once more. The metallic object, previously overlooked by both deputies and prosecution, now seemed to demand scrutiny. The room's tension thickened imperceptibly, though the adults, unaware of the significance, continued with routine procedural focus. Timothy glanced at his nephew, his eyes narrowing slightly. There was a silent connection forming, though neither he nor Mary fully understood its implications. The ordinary expectation of courtroom procedure, a measured presentation of evidence, structured witness statements, and predictable examination, was quietly being challenged by the unlikely alliance of a toddler's observation and a K-9's trained instinct. The invisible threads of attention were beginning to intersect in ways that could unravel assumptions. The judge, unaware of the subtleties unfolding in the back row, called for a short recess. 10 minutes, he announced, his voice carrying authority and finality. Spectators stirred, whispering to one another, while Timothy allowed himself a shallow breath, trying to maintain calm. Mary instinctively moved closer to Noah, kneeling beside him, and whispered softly, "What are you seeing, sweetie?" Noah's eyes remained fixed on Rex. "Doggy Shiny, not Uncle Tim, bad man not here," he whispered, his voice carrying a certainty that seemed impossible for a child so young. Mary's hand trembled slightly as she brushed his hair from his forehead. The words were innocent, fragmented, yet they struck a chord within her. It was as if Noah was observing the scene not merely with the eyes of a child, but with the clarity of someone perceiving truth unfiltered by bias or expectation. During the recess, Harold Jensen approached Mary cautiously. He had noticed the child's unusual focus on Rex, though he could not yet interpret its significance. "Mary," he said quietly, "I don't know how much of this Noah is noticing, but sometimes the unexpected observations of a child can shed light on things adults miss. Keep him close and quiet, but don't underestimate him." Mary nodded, her heart racing. Harold's words validated a strange intuition she had begun to feel. The idea that her child, through innocence, might reveal details overlooked in adult reasoning. When the trial resumed, the prosecution presented the next piece of evidence: a set of fingerprints and a small collection of household items recovered near the scene. The gallery leaned forward, the jurors listening intently. Timothy's hands were steady, but inside, he braced for every possible line of attack. The prosecution's lead attorney pointed to the evidence, asserting that it linked Timothy directly to the alleged crime. Yet as he did so, Noah, still seated beside his mother, whispered again, "Doggy, no Uncle Tim, Doggy knows." Mary's stomach clenched. She had tried to teach Noah politeness and quiet observation, yet now the child's words seemed to carry weight, unintentional but profound. Harold noticed the subtle exchange, his eyes narrowing in realization. The toddler's observation, though not articulated in legal terms, could hint at a truth that the adults had failed to consider. The innocence of a child, unburdened by motive or expectation, had a clarity that often eluded seasoned professionals. The courtroom atmosphere subtly shifted. Officers and spectators sensed, if not fully understood, that a minor anomaly had occurred. Rex, still attentive to the metallic object and its surrounding space, shifted slightly, signaling continued interest. Officer Daniels followed the dog's instinctual cue, moving toward the object with care. For the first time, the prosecution's confident composure showed signs of unease. A detail overlooked during investigation had now resurfaced, and its implications were unclear. Noah, encouraged by Rex's reaction, whispered once more, "Doggy, not Uncle Tim, see shiny, bad man." Mary's hand gripped his small shoulder, trying to hold back both panic and awe. The clarity of his statement, unfiltered by fear, bias, or knowledge of legal stakes, was astonishing. It highlighted a critical gap. While the prosecution had focused on circumstantial evidence, the truth lay in a detail they had dismissed. Timothy felt a flicker of hope. He could not articulate the reason, yet he sensed that his nephew's innocent observation was creating space for reconsideration, for doubt to enter what had seemed a predetermined outcome. The courtroom's routine, so meticulously controlled, was beginning to fracture. The ordinary expectations of procedure were giving way to the subtle interventions of a child's insight and a dog's trained instincts. Harold Jensen, sensing an opportunity, subtly adjusted his strategy. "Your Honor," he said, leaning forward slightly, "we may need to revisit certain evidence. It has come to our attention through unusual circumstances that a critical detail may have been overlooked." The judge raised an eyebrow, nodding the formal language, unaware of the child quietly observing from the gallery. Yet in that moment, the tide of the trial began to shift imperceptibly. As proceedings continued, witnesses described events with increasing detail, yet Noah's words and Rex's attentive behavior created an invisible ripple. Every glance, every whisper, seemed to underscore the possibility that the initial assumptions might be incomplete or flawed. Spectators leaned forward, sensing tension without understanding its source. Mary, holding Noah's hand, felt a mixture of pride and anxiety. Her child's innocent voice, seemingly trivial, had quietly begun to influence the course of the trial. Rex's movements, subtle yet deliberate, directed attention to the object overlooked during earlier inspections. Officer Daniels examined it carefully, noting marks, textures, and indications previously unnoticed. The prosecution, caught in the rhythm of routine procedures, had missed the nuance. And Noah, a small, 3-year-old observer, had provided the initial cue, a whisper of guidance invisible to the majority yet profoundly significant. The judge, noting the renewed focus on the evidence, called for a brief discussion at the bench. Lawyers, deputies, and Timothy rose quietly, leaving Mary and Noah momentarily seated. Yet the impact of the child's observations lingered in the air like a subtle perfume, inescapable, influential, and quietly reshaping perceptions. Even in his absence from the immediate discussion, Noah's role had become pivotal. When court resumed, the metallic object was examined in full view of the jury. Its details contradicted prior assumptions. Fingerprints did not match Timothy. Traces indicated the presence of an unknown individual. The prosecution's narrative began to unravel, and the jurors shifted slightly in their seats, sensing the emergence of doubt where certainty had previously prevailed. Timothy exhaled slowly, the first real sense of relief threading through his nervous composure. Noah, blissfully unaware of the full significance, whispered softly, "Doggy told right." His words were innocent, simple, yet their truth resonated with everyone in the room. A 3-year-old's perception, combined with a dog's trained instincts, had exposed a flaw in what adults assumed to be a complete and unassailable case. The ordinary trial had quietly transformed into a moment of revelation, guided by the unlikeliest of witnesses. The courtroom had grown unusually quiet as the afternoon sunlight streamed in through the tall windows. Timothy Reynolds remained seated at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, though a subtle tension in his jaw suggested the anticipation gnawed at him. The jury, previously engaged in meticulous note-taking and measured glances, now seemed collectively aware that the trial had taken a curious turn. Unseen by most, a small 3-year-old and a police K-9 were quietly orchestrating a revelation that would forever change the course of the proceedings. Noah, kneeling at the back near his mother, leaned forward, eyes wide with fascination. "Doggy fine shiny thing," he whispered, his voice carrying a clarity that was almost startling. Rex, ever alert, lifted his nose slightly, ears perking. The German Shepherd's instincts, honed through years of training, registered the subtle cues in Noah's tone. There was no doubt, no fear, only observation and interest. To Rex, the child's words were unlike the commands he had learned from humans, but there was a resonance, a thread of meaning that drew him forward. Mary glanced at her son, uncertainty and awe battling within her. "Noah, be quiet, sweetie," she whispered, brushing his hair back gently, yet she could not suppress a smile at his intense concentration. There was something extraordinary about the way he focused, so completely absorbed in the dynamics of the room that it was impossible not to feel that something remarkable was unfolding. She had no idea how pivotal Noah's attention had already become. Across the courtroom, Timothy observed the quiet interaction. A flicker of hope passed across his face as he noticed Rex subtly shifting, responding to the tiny observer. Though he could not fully interpret the significance, a deep intuition told him that the child's attention and the dog's training were converging in a way that adults had neither predicted nor controlled. His pulse quickened, a quiet mixture of tension and relief threading through him. The prosecution continued presenting evidence, unaware that the ordinary rhythm of the trial had begun to fracture. Fingerprints, photographs, and documents moved across the courtroom with practiced precision, but the subtle cues between child and dog went unnoticed. To the untrained eye, it was merely the idle curiosity of a toddler and a calm police dog doing their jobs. Yet in reality, the patterns of behavior, attention, and instinct were building toward a revelation that no one present could have anticipated. Noah's gaze remained locked on Rex, and his small hands began to gesture subtly toward the edge of the defense table. "Shiny thing, over there, bad man," he murmured. The words were fragmented, innocent, almost playful, but their clarity carried weight. Mary's stomach tightened as she realized her son was not simply observing. He was noticing patterns, making connections, drawing conclusions in a way that no adult in the room had yet considered. Rex, picking up on the cues, moved closer to the edge of the table. His nose twitched as he circled carefully, nostrils flaring, ears erect. Officer Daniels, still maintaining professional composure, followed the dog's movements, unaware of the subtle prompt that Noah's observations had provided. In that moment, the courtroom atmosphere shifted imperceptibly. The jurors leaned forward ever so slightly, as if sensing that the ordinary narrative was beginning to strain under the weight of unexpected scrutiny. "Doggy, yes, fine now," Noah whispered, voice gaining a sense of urgency. His tone, innocent yet insistent, seemed to translate into action for Rex. The dog's trained instincts had identified an area overlooked during initial inspections, and now, guided by a child's pure observation, he focused with precision. His paws scraped lightly against the polished wood floor as he approached the object that had remained unnoticed, partially hidden beneath the edge of the table. Mary's pulse raced. She had anticipated a normal trial, a straightforward sequence of testimony, evidence, and judgment. Instead, she was witnessing something extraordinary, a toddler's curiosity influencing a trained K9, revealing details that adults had entirely overlooked. She whispered softly to Noah, "Be careful, don't touch it." But he merely nodded, fully absorbed in the silent communication with the dog. Timothy's attention sharpened. He watched the subtle choreography between child and dog, realizing that the routine had shifted. What had begun as ordinary testimony and evidence review had transformed into a moment of revelation, one that combined innocence and instinct in a way that no adult could have orchestrated. He exhaled slowly, feeling a glimmer of hope that the overlooked details might finally provide clarity. Rex paused, nose nearly touching the metallic object. Officer Daniels crouched to examine it, finally recognizing the significance. The small item, a key, previously dismissed as irrelevant, bore markings inconsistent with Timothy's fingerprints. Its location, partially hidden and overlooked, suggested an external presence, a factor the prosecution had not accounted for. A hushed tension swept through the courtroom as the implications slowly registered. Noah, unaware of the enormity of the moment, whispered triumphantly, "Doggy found, not Uncle Tim, bad man." Mary's eyes widened. The words, innocent and fragmented, carried a clarity that resonated far beyond the child's comprehension. Timothy felt a surge of relief. Finally, a tangible shift, a piece of evidence that not only challenged the prosecution's narrative, but illuminated the possibility of someone else's involvement, had emerged, prompted by the unlikely collaboration between a child and a dog. Harold Jensen, noticing the development, moved swiftly to capitalize on it. "Your Honor," he said, voice calm but firm, "we request that the object be entered into evidence and examined thoroughly. Preliminary observations suggest it may alter the context of prior testimony." The judge, intrigued and attentive, nodded. The courtroom buzzed with quiet speculation as officers, lawyers, and jurors recognized the sudden pivot in focus. Rex remained attentive, nose hovering over the object, ears pricked, alert to any additional cues. Noah's small hand pointed repeatedly, murmuring softly, "Shiny doggy nose bad man." His words, innocent in delivery, acted as a catalyst. The courtroom, previously steeped in predictability, now contained a quiet, invisible tension, the anticipation that the ordinary assumptions of guilt could be challenged by something so unexpected, so unconventional. Mary felt a mixture of awe and fear. Her child, 3 years old and unaware of the legal stakes, had drawn attention to the critical detail that adults had overlooked. She could only watch, holding his hand lightly, whispering words of encouragement. The child's innocent engagement with the trained K9 had created a dynamic no one could have predicted, a subtle but undeniable force shaping the unfolding trial. Timothy, for the first time that day, allowed himself a faint smile. His confidence in truth and justice, long tested by the pressure of the trial, found reinforcement in this unexpected turn. The object, the dog, and the child had together challenged the assumptions, providing a thread of clarity where ambiguity had previously dominated. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, sensing the extraordinary nature of the moment. As the object was examined further, forensic details began to emerge. The key had fingerprints that did not match Timothy's, suggesting another individual's involvement. Officer Daniels explained the dog's alert, confirming that Rex's trained instincts had identified a scent pattern inconsistent with prior assumptions. The courtroom murmured with surprise. The prosecution, once confident, now faced the growing realization that critical evidence had been overlooked, its discovery prompted by a combination of innocence, instinct, and attentiveness few could have anticipated. Noah, still kneeling near the bench, whispered quietly, "Doggy, right, see bad man." Mary's eyes filled with tears. The clarity of his words, their coincidence with Rex's actions, and the revelation of overlooked evidence had created a moment of astonishing significance. Timothy exhaled, his relief tempered by the awareness that the trial was far from over, but the odds had shifted in his favor. Harold Jensen moved decisively, requesting the court formally note the dog's identification of the item and Noah's inadvertent observation. The judge, recognizing the unusual circumstance, agreed to have the evidence logged, photographed, and presented to the jury. A subtle yet profound change swept through the room. A moment once ordinary had become extraordinary, guided by the unlikeliest of participants. The jurors, attentive and curious, observed the proceedings with renewed interest. The combination of a toddler's focus and a K-9's trained instincts had brought forward a tangible element of doubt, challenging the previously accepted narrative. Timothy sat back, a mixture of relief and cautious optimism threading through him. The ordinary courtroom routine had been disrupted in a way that seemed improbable, yet undeniable in its impact. Noah, unaware of the significance, leaned back against his mother, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Doggy, good doggy," he whispered softly. The simplicity of the statement belied its enormous impact. In the delicate ecosystem of observation, evidence, and truth, the child's curiosity and the dog's instincts had converged to expose a reality adults had overlooked. The courtroom remained tense but focused, with a renewed awareness that the ordinary assumptions could no longer dominate. Timothy's case, once perceived as straightforward and vulnerable, had now entered a realm where innocence, instinct, and overlooked details carried unprecedented weight. The trial, already remarkable, had reached a pivot point, guided by the unexpected collaboration of a child and a police dog. In that quiet moment, as sunlight shifted across the polished floors and the judge called the next witness, Mary held Noah's hand tightly. She felt a mixture of pride, awe, and wonder. Her child, through curiosity alone, had played a role that no adult could replicate. And Rex, calm and attentive, had translated that innocence into action, uncovering critical evidence that could shift the scales of justice. The ordinary trial had transformed into something extraordinary, a convergence of observation, instinct, and truth that defied expectation. And in the center of it all, a small child's curiosity had begun to illuminate a path no one could have foreseen. The courtroom had grown quiet again, attention hovering like a fog over polished wood and heavy leather chairs. Timothy Reynolds sat at the defense table, shoulders slightly relaxed but eyes keenly scanning the room. For the first time that day, hope stirred quietly beneath the anxiety that had gripped him since the trial began. The day had started like any other, witnesses reciting their statements, lawyers presenting evidence, and the prosecution building a narrative that seemed airtight. Yet now, an unusual force, innocence and instinct, was quietly unsettling the carefully constructed story. Noah, perched near the back with Mary beside him, whispered to Rex again. "Doggy, over there, not Uncle Tim, bad man." His voice carried certainty, though it was fragile and melodic like the soft hum of a distant wind. Rex, attentive and poised, twitched his ears, then pivoted toward the area Noah had indicated, his nose lowering as he moved carefully. The German shepherd's actions were subtle, but to those who understood police training, each movement carried meaning, a signal that something critical had been identified. Mary's heartbeat quickened as she realized her son's actions were directly influencing the situation. She had initially worried about him disrupting the trial, but now she saw that his innocent focus was catalyzing the discovery of overlooked evidence. She whispered softly, brushing his hair from his forehead, "Be careful, Noah, just watch." Yet she could not contain the swell of awe she felt. The combination of her son's perception and Rex's trained instincts had created a dynamic that no one in the room could have anticipated. Across the room, Timothy noticed the subtle shift. The prosecution team, confident earlier, now exhibited a faint unease, though they did not yet understand why. Witnesses, previously speaking with measured certainty, hesitated slightly as their statements were implicitly challenged by the unfolding revelation. A ripple of uncertainty began to travel through the courtroom, subtle yet unmistakable. What had been perceived as a straightforward case was beginning to show cracks that Timothy sensed could widen into a decisive advantage. Harold Jensen, Timothy's defense attorney, observed the interaction with a careful, measured attention. His eyes narrowed slightly as he noticed Rex circling the metallic object that had been overlooked. "Your Honor," he called quietly, "we would like to formally request that the court acknowledge this newly discovered evidence and consider its implications. Preliminary observation indicates it may contradict earlier assumptions." The judge, intrigued by the unusual circumstance, nodded. A subtle murmur ran through the courtroom. The ordinary rhythm of testimony and cross-examination had been disrupted by something no one had foreseen. The prosecution, initially dismissive of the dog's interest, began to feel unease. Their lead attorney, Jennifer Collins, frowned as Officer Daniels confirmed the dog's alert on the metallic object. The key, previously ignored, now drew attention for its potential significance. Collins' confident tone wavered slightly as she attempted to maintain control of the courtroom. "This is irrelevant," she said, though her voice carried a hint of uncertainty. The jurors, however, had begun to notice the shift in energy, a subtle indication that the narrative was no longer straightforward. Noah, sensing Rex's focus and responding instinctively, leaned forward again. "Doggy, bad man, shiny thing, not Uncle Tim." His words, innocent and fragmented, carried a resonance that seemed to communicate a truth adults had not yet fully grasped. Mary's eyes widened and she gripped his small hand tightly. Timothy exhaled slowly, relief threading through his tense posture. The combination of child observation and dog instinct had uncovered a tangible, concrete detail that challenged the assumptions on which the prosecution had relied. Officer Daniels, following Rex's lead, examined the object carefully. The fingerprints and traces indicated an unknown presence. "This doesn't match Mr. Reynolds," he stated quietly, his professional detachment tinged with astonishment. The courtroom murmured, the energy shifting from routine examination to an awareness that the previously uncontested narrative was in jeopardy. Every movement, every subtle gesture began to carry extraordinary weight. Harold Jensen rose to address the court. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now have evidence that challenges the earlier conclusions. What has been discovered, a detail overlooked, raises doubt about Mr. Reynolds' involvement. We ask that this be considered with the seriousness it deserves." The words, calm and deliberate, contrasted sharply with the tension building in the room. The jury, previously guided by the prosecution's confident presentation, now faced a tangible reason to question assumptions. Timothy's pulse raced as he watched the jurors' reactions. He had spent the past several months bracing for the prosecution's case, yet now, through the most unexpected means, doubt had begun to infiltrate the room. A small child's observations, combined with a K-9's trained instincts, had created an opening in the prosecution's narrative, an opening Timothy had not dared hope for. The ordinary pattern of the trial was quietly fracturing under the weight of this revelation. Jennifer Collins attempted to regain control, calling for further clarification and re-examining previous evidence. "We maintain that Mr. Reynolds is still implicated," she said, trying to mask the uncertainty creeping into her voice. Yet the jury's attention was shifting subtly, guided not by rhetoric but by the tangible, observable reality presented by the object and the dog's alert. The ordinary courtroom procedures, the careful presentation of statements, the predictable rhythm of cross-examination, had been disrupted in a way that words alone could not correct. Noah, blissfully unaware of the legal significance, continued whispering softly to Rex, "Doggy, no, not Uncle Tim, bad man." Each word seemed to reinforce the unfolding revelation, like a gentle echo guiding the dog's attention. Mary held her breath, her heart pounding. The innocence of her child, paired with the rigor of a trained K9, had produced a phenomenon that challenged the adults' expectations of how evidence should emerge. The jurors leaned forward, curiosity and attention sharpening. Every subtle gesture from the dog, every fragment of observation from the child, became a part of the evolving narrative. Timothy could feel the courtroom energy changing, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in perception that began to favor him. The ordinary confidence of the prosecution's team was being undermined by an extraordinary confluence of innocence, instinct, and attention to detail. Harold Jensen capitalized on the moment. "Your Honor, if it pleases the court, we would like to call the officer and the dog as demonstrative evidence. The dog's alert, guided by Mr. Reynolds' nephew's observation, has identified a critical detail that alters the context of prior evidence." The judge, intrigued by the unusual request, agreed. The courtroom murmured as officers and lawyers prepared for this unprecedented demonstration. Rex, poised and focused, moved toward the location indicated by Noah. The child's gestures and whispers acted as subtle guidance, and the dog's trained instincts did the rest. The metallic object, a small but significant piece of evidence, was now fully examined in the presence of the jury. Its details, a fingerprint pattern inconsistent with Timothy's, traces indicating another individual, challenged the assumptions that had previously dominated the prosecution's case. Noah, watching intently, whispered softly, "Doggy, see, bad man." Mary's eyes filled with tears. She could barely believe the scene unfolding before her. Her 3-year-old had, in his innocence, unknowingly contributed to revealing a critical flaw in the prosecution's narrative. The child's voice, fragile and melodic, had guided the dog's attention to an overlooked truth, and that truth now stood before the jury. The courtroom energy shifted decisively. Jurors exchanged glances, observers murmured quietly, and even the judge's expression reflected a recognition that the ordinary assumptions no longer held. Timothy, sensing the tide turning, allowed himself a cautious smile. The unlikely alliance of a child and a K9 had created an opening, a thread of doubt that could unravel the prosecution's otherwise confident case. Jennifer Collins struggled to respond. She attempted to emphasize prior evidence, cross-examine witnesses again, and question the dog's reliability, yet the courtroom dynamics had changed. The jury's attention was anchored to tangible observations, not rhetorical argument. The ordinary assumptions, once unquestioned, were now subject to scrutiny by a combination of innocence, instinct, and undeniable evidence. Noah, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, whispered one final statement to Rex. "Doggy, right, not Uncle Tim." His words, simple and unfiltered, crystallized the significance of the situation. The object, the dog's alert, and the child's observation converged into a coherent signal of truth that challenged every assumption the prosecution had relied upon. Mary squeezed her son's hand, pride and awe mingling with relief. Timothy exhaled slowly, a subtle but profound sense of hope threading through his tension. The trial, once dominated by the prosecution's confident narrative, had now shifted in an unexpected and extraordinary way. The ordinary had given way to the extraordinary, guided by the smallest participant in the room and the keen instincts of a trained K9. As the courtroom prepared for the next phase, Harold Jensen addressed the jury once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to consider the evidence carefully. What has emerged is not speculation. It is tangible, demonstrable fact. The child's observation, combined with the dog's trained response, has revealed a critical detail previously overlooked. Doubt now exists, and that doubt must be considered with the seriousness it deserves. The jurors, attentive and thoughtful, absorbed the words with renewed focus. Every subtle gesture from Noah, every movement by Rex, reinforced the evidence in a manner that words alone could not replicate. The ordinary certainty of the prosecution's narrative had been unsettled, replaced by a cautious openness to possibility. Timothy leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The trial, which had begun as routine and predictable, had transformed into something extraordinary. A child's innocence and a dog's instinct had created a pivotal moment, subtly dismantling assumptions and introducing doubt where certainty had once prevailed. The courtroom now stood on the precipice of change, guided by the most unlikely of witnesses. White heavy checkmark word count. ~1 350. The courtroom had grown almost unbearably silent, a tension so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Timothy Reynolds sat at the defense table, his hands clasped in front of him, knuckles pale. Days of testimony, months of anxiety, and years of fear for a false accusation all culminated in this pivotal moment. The ordinary rhythm of the trial, the carefully orchestrated witness statements, the meticulous presentation of evidence, had been irrevocably altered by the quiet, extraordinary influence of a 3-year-old and a police dog. Noah, still perched at the back beside his mother, had grown increasingly confident in his observations. "Doggy, over there. Shiny bad man," he whispered, his voice clear and insistent. Rex, attentive and calm, lifted his nose, scanning the area indicated by the child. Each subtle gesture from Noah guided the dog, who moved with precision, alert to what the tiny observer had noticed. The courtroom had become an arena where innocence and instinct outshone practiced rhetoric. Mary held her son's hand tightly, sensing the magnitude of the moment but trying not to overwhelm him. Her heart pounded as she watched the interaction unfold. Noah's words were simple, fragmented, yet unfiltered by fear or confusion. They carried a clarity that adults, weighed down by assumptions, had entirely missed. The metallic object, partially hidden beneath the edge of the defense table, now lay fully exposed, waiting to reveal its secrets. Harold Jensen, Timothy's defense attorney, leaned forward subtly. His eyes were sharp, calculating how best to leverage the extraordinary circumstances. "Your Honor," he said, "we would like to demonstrate how the dog's trained response, guided by the observations of Mr. Reynolds' nephew, has led us to evidence that directly contradicts previous assumptions. We request that this demonstration be observed closely by the jury." The judge, intrigued yet careful, nodded. The room murmured with anticipation. Rex approached the object with deliberate focus, his nose hovering over the small metallic key. Officer Daniels, crouched beside him, examined the item once more, carefully noting the intricate details. The key bore fingerprints that did not match Timothy's. Traces suggested a presence unknown to both the prosecution and previous investigators. The dog's alert, subtle yet unmistakable, confirmed that this was not ordinary evidence. It was a lead, a breakthrough that had been overlooked entirely. Noah, observing Rex, whispered again, "Doggy knows, not Uncle Tim, bad man." Mary's chest tightened as the simplicity of the statement conveyed a profound truth. Her child, completely unaware of the legal stakes, had guided the K-9 to the evidence that could dismantle the prosecution's narrative. Timothy's pulse quickened, a cautious hope threading through the anxiety that had gripped him for months. The ordinary trial had shifted into a moment of revelation. The jury leaned forward, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, surprise, and skepticism. What they were witnessing was extraordinary. A toddler, through observation alone, had directed the attention of a trained police dog to evidence critical to the case. For the first time, they were not relying solely on testimony or legal argument. They were seeing a demonstration of truth unfolding before them. Harold Jensen addressed the court again, calm but authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we now have tangible evidence that challenges the assumptions presented earlier. This key, identified by the dog under the guidance of a child's observation, introduces doubt where certainty was previously asserted. I ask that you consider this carefully as we move forward." The jurors, visibly intrigued, studied the metallic object and exchanged quiet glances. The prosecution, visibly unsettled, tried to regain control. Jennifer Collins stood, attempting to minimize the impact of the revelation. "While the object may be of some interest," she argued, "it does not negate the broader evidence against Mr. Reynolds." Her tone, confident at first, faltered under the weight of scrutiny. The jurors' attention had shifted. They were no longer listening purely to rhetoric. They were observing evidence emerging in real time, guided by forces no one could have anticipated. Timothy's heart pounded in his chest. For months, he had felt the weight of accusations, the strain of false narratives, and the frustration of circumstantial evidence stacked against him. Now, through an extraordinary combination of innocence and instinct, the truth had begun to assert itself. His nephew's simple observations and the dog's trained alert had uncovered a detail no adult had anticipated, a detail that cast doubt on the prosecution's entire premise. Officer Daniels documented the evidence carefully. The fingerprints did not match Timothy, and the traces indicated an external presence, suggesting a perpetrator entirely separate from the accused. The room buzzed with quiet tension, jurors leaning forward, absorbing the significance. What had started as an ordinary trial had transformed into a courtroom spectacle of perception and truth. Noah, unaware of the magnitude of his contribution, whispered softly again, "Doggy right, see bad man." Mary felt tears prick her eyes. Her son's voice, innocent and untainted by knowledge or bias, had guided a trained K9 to a revelation that adults had missed entirely. Timothy, exhaling slowly, felt hope replace anxiety for the first time. The extraordinary had unfolded from the ordinary, guided by observation, instinct, and truth. Harold Jensen rose once more, capitalizing on the moment. "Your Honor, we request that the evidence be formally considered in light of these findings. The child's observations, confirmed through the dog's trained response, demonstrate that critical assumptions must be reevaluated. Doubt now exists where certainty was previously claimed." The judge, nodding thoughtfully, instructed the jury to consider the evidence carefully, emphasizing that its implications were significant. The prosecution attempted to counter, calling witnesses to reinforce prior claims. Yet each assertion now faced an invisible barrier. The jury had witnessed the direct interplay of observation, instinct, and evidence. No longer could they accept assumptions unchallenged. The metallic key, the dog's alert, and the child's observations now formed a narrative independent of argument, a narrative rooted in the undeniable reality of what had occurred. Timothy's nerves slowly eased, replaced by cautious optimism. He had entered the trial fearful and constrained by circumstances beyond his control. Yet now, he could see a path to vindication, illuminated by forces he could not have orchestrated but was profoundly grateful for. The courtroom had shifted, subtly but decisively, in his favor. Noah, oblivious to the tension, whispered one final phrase to Rex. "Doggy found bad man." The words, simple and innocent, captured the essence of the revelation. The metallic object had revealed the presence of another individual, someone whose involvement explained prior inconsistencies. The jury absorbed the reality. The evidence, guided by observation and instinct, contradicted the prosecution's narrative, introducing doubt that could not be ignored. The judge called for a brief recess before closing arguments. The atmosphere was electric. Lawyers and officers exchanged hurried notes, jurors whispered quietly, and Timothy exhaled deeply, allowing himself a moment of relief. The trial, once predictable and routine, had become a story of revelation, guided by a child's innocence and a dog's trained instincts. The ordinary had given way to the extraordinary, and the truth had begun to emerge unmistakably. When proceedings resumed, Harold Jensen presented his closing argument with precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence you have observed is not merely circumstantial. It is demonstrable. A trained police dog, guided by a child's observation, has identified a critical detail that challenges every prior assumption. This is not conjecture, it is fact. You are tasked with weighing doubt, and doubt now exists where certainty was previously claimed. I urge you to consider this truth carefully. The prosecution's closing argument struggled to counter the tangible demonstration. Jennifer Collins attempted to emphasize prior testimony, but the jury's attention remained anchored to the evidence revealed through the child and the dog. The ordinary courtroom dynamics, the rehearsed statements and careful presentation of evidence, were eclipsed by the unfolding reality that spoke louder than rhetoric. Timothy sat quietly, absorbing the gravity of the moment. His family, the jury, and even the officers had witnessed a revelation that defied expectation. The ordinary proceedings had been transformed into an extraordinary convergence of innocence and instinct. The final moments of the trial would determine not only the verdict, but the recognition of the profound role that observation and truth could play in justice. Finally, the jury returned. Silence fell over the courtroom as the foreperson stood. Each word was deliberate, measured, carrying the weight of responsibility. We, the jury, find the defendant, Timothy Reynolds, not guilty on all charges. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Relief, disbelief, and quiet joy mingled in the air. Timothy's knees nearly buckled. He gripped the edge of the table, tears threatening. Mary gathered Noah into her arms, whispering words of praise and comfort. The child, still blissfully unaware of the full significance, smiled softly and whispered, "Doggy, good doggy." Rex, calm and obedient, remained by Officer Daniel's side, ears perked but relaxed. The dog's instincts had guided the discovery of truth, and now the courtroom acknowledged it, if only silently. Timothy approached Noah and Mary, hugging them tightly. "I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. "Noah, you helped me more than anyone could." The courtroom slowly emptied, conversations buzzing with astonishment and admiration. Journalists, officers, and spectators spoke in hushed tones about the unprecedented circumstances. A trial that had begun as ordinary had concluded as extraordinary, a testament to the power of observation, instinct, and the purity of a child's perception. Timothy walked out of the courtroom with Mary and Noah, his heart light, his steps unburdened by the accusations that had shadowed him. The 3-year-old, holding his mother's hand, glanced up at Rex and giggled, oblivious to the profound role he had played. "Doggy found bad man," he whispered innocently. Timothy smiled, tears glistening, grateful for the unlikely heroes that had revealed the truth. In that moment, the ordinary became extraordinary. Justice had been served, not through complexity or strategy, but through clarity, innocence, and instinct. The trial that could have condemned an innocent man had instead celebrated the improbable partnership of a child and a dog, reminding everyone that sometimes truth reveals itself in the most unexpected ways.